The headline gives off the impression of a rupture, as if Canada has shifted its battery mineral flows toward Japan and shut the United States EV sector out entirely. It is a framing built for impact, designed to fit a thumbnail narrative. But like most simplified narratives, it compresses a far more layered reality into something easier to consume. What has unfolded over the past several weeks is not a sudden act of betrayal. It is a form of risk balancing. And the logic behind it reveals where Canada believes its economic direction is heading, along with its growing uncertainty about Washington as a consistent long-term partner. The starting point is a set of figures that explains the entire situation before any company names matter. China currently holds control over roughly 65% to 70% of global graphite supply. Beyond that, it processes over 90% of all raw flake graphite worldwide into battery-grade spherical material, the exact form used inside lithium-ion cells. On gallium, the concentration is even more extreme. According to the United States Geological Survey, China accounted for 99% of global primary gallium production in 2024. Gallium is far from a niche input. It is embedded in wide bandgap semiconductor systems that power radar technology, satellite communication networks, fifth-generation telecommunications, and precision-guided weapon systems. When a single country dominates a material that underpins both civilian technology and defense infrastructure, the result is not a typical supply chain. It becomes a structural dependency. Over the past 3 years, Beijing has been steadily tightening that dependency in phases. In 2023, export licensing rules were introduced for gallium and germanium, both essential for semiconductor manufacturing and fiber optic systems. By early 2025, those restrictions were expanded to molybdenum, a high-strength material used in aerospace engineering and nuclear-related applications. Then, in February of 2026, the policy escalated again, blocking dual-use exports to 20 Japanese firms that Beijing accused of being linked to Japan's defense supply network. That shift followed statements from Japanese Prime Minister Sai Takaichi indicating that Tokyo could consider military involvement if China moved on Taiwan. Beijing's response was clear in its signaling. Trade pressure could be applied quickly when geopolitical tensions rise. Japan interpreted that message through experience rather than theory. The memory of earlier disruptions still shapes Tokyo's thinking. In 2010, during a territorial dispute with China over the Skaku Islands, rare earth exports to Japan were quietly halted. That event pushed Japan into more than a decade of planning around supply resilience. This was later highlighted by Aiki Tagami, a visiting senior research fellow at Tokyo's Institute of Geoeconomics, during a February 2026 Brookings Institution workshop focused on Japan's critical mineral strategy. What has changed since then is not Japan's concern, but its method of response. According to Tagami, Japan now prefers coordinated action with allies, rather than isolated stockpiling. Maintaining reserves independently is expensive and inefficient when partner nations face the same external pressures. Distributing both cost and strategic buffering across multiple allied economies creates a more durable system, while lowering the burden on each participant. It is within this broader environment that Canada's International Trade Minister Maninder Sidhu led the country's largest trade delegation to the Asia-Pacific region in June of 2026. Around 300 delegates, representing nearly 180 Canadian firms and institutions, traveled to Tokyo. By the time the mission concluded, agreements exceeding $1 billion Canadian had been signed across energy and critical mineral sectors. During the visit, Sidhu described Canada's proposal to Reuters in straightforward terms. The objective was to offer Japan a deeper partnership in critical mineral supply chains. He pointed to an existing arrangement as the model for what could expand further. That example is Nouveau Graphite, a Quebec-based company developing a fully integrated system from ore extraction to anode material production. The structure links the Mattawini graphite mine north of Montreal with a processing facility in Bécancour. In February of 2024, Novamont finalized binding offtake agreements with two major buyers at the same time, Panasonic Energy and General Motors. SAE. Each secured annual supply of 18,000 tons of active anode material. Panasonic's contract runs for 7 years, while General Motors committed for 6. Panasonic also contributed $25 million in early equity investment as part of the agreement. In October of 2025, Nouveau and Panasonic expanded and revised their partnership into a new binding structure, covering 13,000 tons per year over an initial 7-year term, layered on top of the earlier agreement. By March of 2026, the Government of Canada entered directly, signing a revised long-form term sheet committing to purchase 30,000 tons per year of flake graphite concentrate from Mawini over 7 years under a take or pay structure. Pricing was tied to industrial inflation indexes. Together, the Panasonic agreement, General Motors arrangement, and government commitment account for more than 70% of Mawini's planned future production capacity. At the same time, A $335 million financing package was secured through Export Development Canada and the Canada Infrastructure Bank. Nouveau Monde now stands as a clear demonstration of how a Canada-Japan battery materials partnership could operate in practice. The General Motors detail changes the simple version of the locked-out narrative. It is important because General Motors is not missing from this structure. It stands as one of the two primary anchor buyers in Nouveau's framework, positioned directly alongside Panasonic within the same offtake system, sourcing from the same mining site and the same processing infrastructure. The story is not about American exclusion from Canadian graphite flows. It is about Canada constructing redundancy across a supply network that, until recently, was directed overwhelmingly toward the United States and is now being distributed across multiple pathways at the same time. The Tokyo mission also extended beyond graphite alone. Mitsubishi Corporation, which already holds a major stake in LNG Canada, the first liquefied natural gas export facility on Canada's Pacific coastline, signaled active interest in expanding its participation into Canada's critical minerals sector during Maninder Sidhu's visit. Alongside this, both governments began discussions on something structurally deeper than any single supply agreement. They explored joint stockpiling mechanisms for critical minerals, with graphite and gallium identified as priority materials, both carrying direct relevance to defense applications. Heat-resistant graphite is used in rocket nozzle systems and missile nose cone structures. Gallium is a core component in wide-band gap semiconductor technologies that support advanced radar systems and guidance platforms. This framing places the issue far beyond energy transition discussions. It is being addressed as part of military readiness planning. Just 1 week before the Tokyo mission, the G7 gathered for its 2026 summit at Aven-les-Bains in France. Critical minerals became one of the central outcomes of the meeting. Leaders agreed on a coordination framework built around a defined target, reducing reliance on any single non-G7 supplier of rare earth elements and permanent magnets to below 60% by 2030. The final statement avoided directly naming China, reflecting a deliberate diplomatic approach. Allied economies are pursuing the creation of alternative supply systems while still preserving enough engagement with Beijing to avoid triggering direct retaliation. The chosen framing emphasizes diversification rather than full decoupling, and that distinction shapes how quickly these initiatives move forward. During the same summit, Prime Minister Mark Carney presented 13 new or recently finalized partnerships under Canada's Critical Minerals Resilience and Production Alliance. These arrangements include investments, offtake structures, and bilateral financing frameworks. Several of these carry significant commercial weight. Italian energy company EI committed $70 million into Nouveau Graphite's Marouini mine project, marking a strong endorsement from a major European energy player in Canada's battery materials sector. Denmark's Export Credit Agency entered into a financing agreement with Quebec-based First Phosphate. At the same time, Sumitomo Corporation secured a rare earth offtake agreement with Ucore Rare Metals, a developer based in Nova Scotia. That Ucore arrangement is particularly important because it challenges the simplest interpretation of exclusion. The agreement announced on June 15th of 2026 between Ucore and Sumitomo Corporation of the Americas is focused on feedstock supply and offtake development, not for a Canadian facility, but for Ucore's planned Louisiana Strategic Metals Complex located on United States territory. This means one of the most significant rare earth partnerships emerging from the Canada-Japan network is structured to support processing capacity inside the United States itself. Pat Ryan, Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Ucore, described Canada's G7 recognition of the partnership as validation that rare earth separation capacity is now treated as core allied infrastructure rather than a niche industrial segment. The result is a three-layer structure: Canadian and allied supply inputs, Japanese capital and long-term offtake commitments, American-based processing capability. This is not a framework that excludes the United States. It is one that integrates it into a broader trilateral system that would not exist in its current form without shared participation. The real tension, therefore, is not located within these individual agreements. It sits within the surrounding policy environment, particularly in the divergence between Washington and Ottawa on trade strategy. Canada's push toward diversification is unfolding against the backdrop of Section 232 tariff measures, a prolonged and often contentious renegotiation stance from the Trump administration, and a July 1st, 2026, joint review deadline embedded within COSMO under Article 34.7. Over the past year, Ottawa has been managing tariff pressures affecting steel, aluminum, and automotive sectors, while Prime Minister Carney has consistently resisted treating concessions as a prerequisite simply to maintain negotiations. In parallel, Canada has expanded critical minerals partnerships with Japan and Europe through agreements involving EI and Denmark as part of a broader strategy to avoid concentrating leverage in a single relationship. If the United States relationship becomes less predictable, These binding offtake agreements, equity investments, and government-supported supply commitments anchored through Tokyo provide Ottawa with alternative pathways that did not exist 3 years earlier. The United States Treasury Department concluded that the agreement could be treated as a free trade agreement for the purpose of electric vehicle tax credit qualification, even though it was never formally ratified by Congress as a treaty or official FTA. That interpretation triggered criticism from certain members of Congress, who argued that it effectively bypassed standard treaty approval procedures. Despite the controversy, the agreement continues to influence which vehicles remain eligible for the federal EV tax credit in the present system. Under current requirements, at least 60% of the value of critical minerals used in an electric vehicle battery must be extracted or processed in the United States, or in a country that has a free trade agreement with the United States. This threshold is scheduled to increase to 80% by 2027. At the same time, any vehicle containing minerals or components sourced from designated foreign entities of concern is excluded from eligibility. This category includes China and Russia, resulting in immediate disqualification. In February of 2026, the State Department organized a critical minerals ministerial meeting in Washington, bringing together delegations from 54 countries alongside the European Commission, with participation from both Canada and Japan. During the event, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, along with Vice President J.D. Vance, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer announced 11 new bilateral critical minerals frameworks in a single day. This followed 10 additional agreements signed over the previous 5 months. At the same time, Rubio introduced a new coordination structure called FORGE, intended to replace the existing Mineral Security Partnership. The Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office has also been actively financing domestic supply chain development, including a $2.3 billion loan to Lithium America's Thacker Pass project in Nevada, as well as a $996 million loan to Ioneer's Rhyolite Ridge project. Viewed together, these parallel developments clarify the broader structure. The situation is not defined by Canada stepping away from the United States in favor of Japan. Instead, it reflects multiple advanced economies within the G7 orbit building, overlapping and redundant supply systems, in response to a shared vulnerability. Heavy concentration of mining, processing, and refining capacity in China. Canada is pursuing this strategy with Japan partly because Japan has spent more than 15 years developing institutional mechanisms for exactly this type of coordination. It is also driven by Ottawa's current need for additional strategic options beyond its traditional southern trade corridor. At the same time, the United States is advancing its own parallel approach through Department of Energy financing programs, through Treasury's interpretation of the Japan Agreement as equivalent to an FTA for tax credit purposes, and through expanded diplomatic engagement with dozens of partner countries. The actual risk to the United States electric vehicle sector is more specific than the broader narrative suggests. It is not that Canadian graphite or rare earth materials are being cut off from American buyers. General Motors' off-take arrangement with Nuvo remains fully in place alongside Panasonic's commitments. The real shift is occurring in the structure of capital and long-term supply certainty. Financing, equity participation, and offtake commitments in Canada's critical minerals sector are increasingly being distributed across Japanese, European, and broader G7-aligned capital sources, rather than relying predominantly on United States-centered investment. This shift is happening at a time when United States-Canada trade relations are moving through a highly sensitive phase, including the most contentious CUSMA review cycle since the agreement was first ratified. If that process introduces additional friction through tariffs, rules of origin disputes, or FEOC-style restrictions, Canada's expanded network of alternative financing provides significantly more flexibility than existed 3 years earlier. The flexibility represents the real change in leverage. It is gradual, structural, and built through accumulated offtake agreements rather than any single policy announcement. Looking forward, outcomes will depend heavily on the resolution of the CUSMA review process and on whether Canada's Northern Infrastructure Plan, a $40 billion program announced in March of 2026 to unlock mineral deposits in the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, translates into actual production capacity rather than remaining at the level of funding commitments. Infrastructure remains the core constraint. Northern Canada contains significant reserves of battery and defense critical minerals, but without transportation networks, port access, and stable power systems, those resources remain economically inaccessible, regardless of their geological quality. Public investment in infrastructure therefore becomes the enabling factor that determines whether entire mineral regions become viable or remain dormant. The final assessment is not a story of betrayal, it is a story of hedging. Canada has spent the first half of 2026 building additional layers of buyers, financiers, and strategic partners for a sector that has historically been oriented almost entirely toward the United States. Japan has emerged as the most prepared partner for this expansion, due to its long-standing concerns about supply concentration and its established institutional frameworks. The United States remains deeply integrated within this evolving system through General Motors' participation in Nouveau Graphite, through the UKOR Sumitomo Rare Earth project tied to processing capacity in Louisiana, and through its ongoing bilateral critical minerals diplomacy with Japan that dates back to 2023. What has changed most is Ottawa's position heading into a pivotal CUSMA review period. That shift in leverage, built incrementally through contracts, financing structures, and multi-country alignment, is ultimately the central development beneath the headline narrative. The evolution continues to unfold across multiple governments and industries at the same time. The next phase will depend on how those overlapping systems stabilize under trade pressure and infrastructure constraints. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.